Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome to the podcast today Alex Zakaras. Alex is a professor of political science at the University of Vermont, and we've invited him to talk about his recently published Freedom for All: What a Liberal Society Could Be. Alex, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a real pleasure.
So I'm going to ask one easy question and one difficult question. So the easy question is, what made you want to write this book? And then the difficult question is, what is liberalism?
Okay. Thanks. So yeah, I mean, so there's been a lot of books written and books and articles written really since 2016 in the sort of defense of liberalism
What
genre.
happened?
What happened, right? And of course, right, the rise of authoritarian populism, not just here in the States, but around the world, is an important backdrop for all of that. And I found myself kind of frustrated with the tenor of a lot of this defense of liberalism stuff. I thought the predominant tendency was to present liberalism as a kind of pragmatic, moderate, adults in the room sort of alternative to the crazy authoritarian right. And I think, so real emphasis on sort of preserving the integrity of our constitutional order, ensuring the continuity of our democratic systems. And look, all of this is deeply important, right? I mean, we're facing an all-out assault on American democracy and liberalism in this country right now. But it's also really not enough. I've spent the last 20 years in classrooms teaching liberalism to undergraduates, and one thing I can tell you for sure is that this kind of moderating, pragmatic, gradual reform posture is really unsatisfying to people who've spent who've grown up right in over the last couple of decades in this country and see it's the danger here is in presenting liberalism as a kind of an effort to preserve the pre-Trump status quo against disruption, right? But for young people who've grown up with a pervasive sense of crisis, the climate crisis, the aftermath of the Great Recession, rising economic insecurity and inequality, the crisis of racial policing and mass incarceration, I mean, those messages just don't land, right? I mean, and so part of what I'm trying to do in the book is recover a different kind of liberal posture, to sort of excavate and recover a more radical and ambitiously egalitarian version of liberalism, which has always been there, I think, in American history, certainly in political theory. And so the book's an attempt to kind of represent liberalism as a kind of boldly ambitious vision for egalitarian transformation.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I mean, to my mind, that is really just an artifact of the fact that it's been hegemonic for so long. Like liberalism, I truly think that both the Fordist and the neoliberal eras are fundamentally liberal in different ways. But and so the arguments you saw after 2016 are the arguments of sort of almost an inertial liberalism or a lazy liberalism because it hasn't had to defend itself for almost a century. And I do think that is the case. So I do want to know the what is liberalism question because I think a theorist like yourself and a historian like myself have very different approaches. You refer to what I would refer to as proto liberals, writing in the 17th and 18th centuries, and sort of prefigure what I would call liberalism as a political ideology, which to my mind really only begins in the wake of the French Revolution, when these ideas are attached to a political movement that could meaningfully be identified as liberal. So I want you to answer that question, and then I also have a broader question about liberalism in the United States, because I actually think liberalism is quite a shallow history in this country, actually, when compared to Europe. And it's not for nothing that a lot of the theorists that I think people read about liberalism are not American theorists. You go to Tocqueville or what have you, or Arendt. And later on in the second half of the 20th century, it's there. But I am curious about your thought on that. So what is liberalism? Why go back to the Enlightenment? Why not ground it in political movements? I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, good. So let me take those two questions a little bit separately. So I think right. I mean, I'm grateful for the definitional question to start. I mean, there's a lot of confusion, obviously, in the way the term liberal is used in our political culture. It's commonly used just kind of to gesture at people who fall left of center. Right, things are too liberal. The way I use it in the book, I offer a kind of two-part definition, and of course, this is really contested terrain. I try to be as succinct as possible here, but I think liberalism, in my view, seen from the point of view of a political theorist, consists of two things. Has two dimensions: a kind of shared goal and a shared set of political strategies. And I'd say the shared goal is broadly to create conditions under which people can live freely. I think liberals have typically seen that as the kind of the most important objective of government. And they've emphasized private freedoms in particular. So the freedom to speak and worship, the freedom to criticize government, the freedom to love who you want to love, to work, to own property, and a host of other things, right? And then there's a laundry list of core strategies that liberals have typically embraced, in my view, to try to achieve that goal. And these include constitutions, individual rights overseen by independent judiciaries, the rule of law, democratic accountability, checks and balances, a free media, a market economy, and independent civil society. So those, to me, those are sort of that's the core definition of liberalism. If you agree with that set of strategies and you're committed to a politics that foregrounds freedom and personal freedom in particular, then you're a liberal.
Who are key thinkers, just as an intellectual historian? Like, what is the genealogy here?
Well, it depends on what period you want to talk about. I mean, I've done a fair amount. Insofar as I've done intellectual history, it's been the 19th century. I've worked on John Stuart Mill, obviously, figures like Emerson and Thoreau, and
Oh, Emerson and Thoreau. Okay. So yeah, that's what's interesting to me. Like that, the incorporation of those Americans into the liberal tradition to me is always a very interesting move. To me, that reads, okay, cool. No, I'm not. We don't have to get into it because
well, I'm happy to
okay.
get into that. I mean, so actually, the book that I wrote before this one is about American political ideas in the Jacksonian era. So I'm happy to talk about.
I would love to talk about that because to me, to my reading, okay, let's talk about liberalism in the American political tradition because
Yeah.
just as a historical matter, it's a term that's not used really until the early 1930s. And it's essentially used, again, just as a historical matter by FDR, who doesn't want to use the word socialist. So he essentially uses liberal in order to identify it with the New Deal project. So I just, as an educative matter, how do we Americanize the story of liberalism? Because to me, it is such a European story for most of the 19th century. Because the politics that define the United States just do not exist on the spectrum of sort of liberal, conservative, monarchist, reactionary, radical. We're so regional here. We have these very different spheres. There's sort of a New England Anglo thing
Mm-hmm,
happening.
mm-hmm.
But like when you talk about liberalism in the United States, to me, it's quite weak until the middle of the 20th century. But since you wrote a book on it, tell me how make a liberalism American,
Yeah,
please.
well, let me come back, but so I want to get to that. That's a really interesting and important question. But you asked also about sort of periodization and where I would locate the origins of liberalism, and I have to say really skeptical of the view that liberalism should be dated to early 19th century France. And my understanding, I mean, reading people like Helena Rosenblatt, is that and gleaning from what you've just said, you're placing a lot of emphasis on the term liberalism and when it comes into circulation and when people begin to identify as liberals. To me, that's quite a different question, actually, than to me, the more interesting question, and it's really a question that's about 18th century political thought, is at what point, so, 18th century anti-monarchical thinking is predominantly Republican, right? It draws on this kind of long tradition of Republican thinking going back through the Renaissance to the classical period.
Yeah, Pocock, everyone.
Right. So at
A
what point,
Machiavellian moment. Yeah.
right. So at what point, the interesting question is, and so in the second half of the 18th century, people a diverse cast of people from Scottish Enlightenment figures like Adam Smith and Ferguson to American figures like Madison and Jefferson and Tom Paine are reformulating and reinterpreting this Republican tradition in new ways, right, to accommodate new economic and political realities. They're formulating a vision of free society that they see as applicable now to mass, religiously diverse societies that are growing economically, that have a rising middle class, right? That they're reaching for the language of market freedom and representation in new ways, right? And so it seems to me that it's in that period, over the second half of the 18th century, that there emerges a body of thinking that's distinct enough from its Republican antecedents that we can start calling it liberal. Now, people like Rosenblatt who want to say liberalism doesn't start till, France in the 1820s or 1830s. I mean, you end up having to exclude or label as pre-liberal, right, a whole bunch of stuff that just like, so we're talking about the French Declaration of the rights of the man and the citizen, the Declaration of Independence, Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, which is his defense of religious disestablishment in 1785 in Virginia. If that's not a liberal document, I don't know what is.
I think
right? You're talking about Tom Paine. You're talking about Wollstonecraft and the vindication of the rights of women. I mean, these are seen through the lens that I've just given you, right? I'm not talking about the label, and to me, that's not centrally relevant here. It's about the existence of a tradition of ideas that has its own defining characteristics, that's now separated itself from republicanism enough, and now we can call it liberal. And I think we have to call those things liberal, right? Anyway, that's my view.
No, I mean, I think it's just a methodological difference. I mean, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer to this one. I'm a historian. I just have a more materialist perspective. I think ideas are floaty. I mean, then you get people like Larry Seaton Top tracing liberalism to St. Paul, right? And so to me, it's literally just a methodological difference, and your argument makes total sense. I get it. There's nothing wrong. It's a distinguishing from the Republican tradition. But I think you have to connect it to lived political movements when you're talking about it primarily as a political philosophy.
Mm-hmm.
And so that to me is the move that Rosenblatt makes. And that's what I agree with when you're looking at it as like a political ideology. Because I mean, even in your own work, you connect it to strategy. And so, Hamilton writing about various, the Navy or whatnot, or the central bank is a type of strategy, but it's disconnected from the Federalists and what they're actually, imagining themselves to be. But I take your point, and I don't disagree with it necessarily. It's just a different choice about how one tries to imagine this. So then you see the United States as having essentially a liberal tradition linked back to the founding moment, however one wants to define that, and that's sort of taken through New England political thoughts, and that is eventually sort of permeates the country. And like, as always, the liberals have their blind spots with the Three-Fifths Compromise and slavery, and even though many of them become abolitionists. So that's the sort of American liberal tradition. And like Lincoln is a liberal in this framework, right? Like you would identify Lincoln as a liberal.
Oh, of course. Yeah, I would. I mean, yeah, Lincoln is a complicated figure and drawing on obviously on still the Republican tradition in certain ways, drawing on elements of Protestant radicalism, drawing on, but yes, predominantly I'd position it as a liberal figure. Yeah. I mean, and I would say, and this gets to some of the part of the argument of the book, where does political radicalism, egalitarian political radicalism, come from in the United States? How is it articulated? It seems to me that throughout the 19th century, it exists predominantly as a kind of radical Lockeanism or radical republicanism. But the radical Lockeanism consists in basically embracing certain fundamental liberal assumptions that human beings are created equal, right? That they're endowed with certain natural rights, that the government's primary and most important moral responsibility is to secure and protect those rights, right? And so whether it's working men's movements in the cities that on the eastern seaboard in the early 19th century, asserting their rights to the fruits of their own labor, which is a kind of that this kind of the idea that we're entitled to the fruits of our labor, and that elites in various ways, whether be they bankers or corporations or governments taxing us excessively, or trying to steal what belongs rightly to us, is a kind of a version of this kind of radical Lockeanism. But the laying claim to rights, expanding the ambit of those rights, insisting on, that this runs through the early feminist and the abolitionist movements, which, I mean, I've done a lot of work on abolitionism in the 1830s and 40s, which very much employs this kind of Lockean framework of natural rights. And people like Dan Rogers have written really, really richly about how malleable and explosive the language of the essentially liberal language of natural rights has been in various different contexts across American history. So part of the liberalism I'm trying to articulate in the book draws, I think, on this tradition going all the way back to people like Tom Paine and the abolitionists of the 1830s.
So how do you put this in context with people in Europe who are using the term liberal and who are envisioning themselves as liberals? One, just a basic, why isn't that term really used in the United States? And two, how do you connect this type of transatlantic thing where, to my mind, and this is not my specialty, I'm a 20th century guy, but they are imagining themselves as engaged in a different project than Gladstone or whomever we're thinking about in Europe at the time. So how do you connect this sort of wide space that you're imagining as sort of this liberal sphere in the 19th century? How do they relate to one another?
Oh God, I don't know that I can give a good, succinct answer to that. I mean, it seems like there are so many different kind of transatlantic cross currents at different moments. I mean, you were talking about social movements, and I think the story of American liberalism begins partly with the evangelical Protestant movements against religious establishment and repression, and they're drawing self-consciously on, again, a kind of Lockean but also radical Protestant language, European radical Protestant language that they've imported, right? So there's that. I mean, the Scottish Enlightenment infuses the thinking of people like Jefferson and other founders. The dawn of free market ideology, you're seeing people like Cobden getting appropriated and reformulated. I mean, yeah, invariably these ideas, Adam Smith is being appropriated and reformulated in various ways, infused with religious meaning in the United States in a way that his ideas weren't in Britain. I mean, there's a lot of reappropriation and reapplication of these ideas. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting work been done on. Well, then the late 19th century is a whole other can of worms, where you get the influence of Fabian socialism and other being appropriated by American liberals. But so I think I think the answer to that would be a long book.
Yeah, no. So why do you think that term never really found purchase here? There's a liberal party in the UK
Yeah.
in the 1850s. And it's just they don't refer to themselves as liberal. It's really, to me, it emerges basically, to my mind, it's a rebranding of the left wing of the progressive movement of the 1890s and the 1920s as liberal in the 1930s. But why is that term never really used in this country until later?
I don't actually have a good answer to that question. I wish I did. Yeah.
It's always befuddled me because, like, I totally agree with, like, there are these Lockean cross currents and it's always been interesting to me. But okay, why don't I ask you, what do you think is the story of liberalism in the 20th century United States, and what happened to it, and why do you need to engage in a project of recovery here, of a radical liberalism? Because I think understanding your view of that will help illuminate the book, and then we'll get to the book proper.
Yeah, and I should say I'm definitely not a 20th century historian, and so I'm going to defer to you on a lot of these things. But in broad brushstrokes, right? I mean, there's the sort of reclamation project takes aim at two different tendencies that have served, I think, to moderate and moderate is probably not the right term when it comes to neoliberalism. But so one of the major arcs of the book is sort of here, the rise of neoliberalism, the rise of the Reagan coalition. I mean, starting in the late 70s, 80s, and the sort of the transformation of liberalism from within as sort of market fundamentalist ideas came to take a kind of central place in it. And to me, this, I mean, absolutely paved the way for where we are today, the current political crisis. I mean, the story that I tell about Trump, political scientists have a lot of different stories, overlapping stories mostly, about how authoritarian populism came to our doorstep. But the one that I've always found most compelling centers neoliberalism and the effect it's had on our economy, and the sort of cratering of public trust in our institutions as a result. And I'm happy to talk about that in some detail because that's a major theme in the book. So when I talk to my students, I sometimes I teach a seminar on liberalism. One of the things we do, like, okay, let's do a little free association on the first day of class. What does that word mean to you, right? And often nowadays, I have free markets, deregulation, right, inequality, these sorts of things, right? So the very meaning and as a result, my students, I mean, this is University of Vermont, don't identify with this tradition. Right? They don't know exactly. I mean, many identify as maybe socialists, but or something else, but they don't know quite where their intellectual home is. So that's one, right? And then the other, I mean, I've done, so you obviously write on Cold War liberalism. Isaiah Berlin is somebody I've spent a fair amount of time with. Is actually one of my pathways into political theory as a discipline. I was sort of captivated by some of his essays in college.
Just very quickly to interrupt, it is always funny how when American academics or academics placed in the United States reconstructed the Cold War liberal tradition, they turn to Europe. This is this is
Right.
like a theme that recurs when Americans reconstruct liberal traditions. I think it is kind of interesting. You have Berlin, you have Popper, you have Aron. You have Jakob Talman and other people like that. Arendt, obviously, she was here though. But yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to Berlin. The archetypal Cold War liberal is in fucking Britain.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, you'd say Judith Sklar, people like Reinhold Niebuhr, Louis Hartz, et cetera, right? But I mean, and you've emphasized this. I mean, that also really reoriented liberalism in the sort of post New Deal period, right? And chastened it in many ways, so that the enemy became utopianism, government overreach. I mean, this relates in some ways centrally to the themes of this book. The freedom is a core concept, and part of what Berlin and other Cold War liberals are doing is trying to redefine the idea of freedom in broadly negative terms. That means freedom, in other words, means the absence of interference, and in particular, the absence of state meddling in our lives, right? And this is the kind of freedom that the ideal of freedom, which also, of course, is pushed by people like Hayek and Milton Friedman and the libertarians, who are becoming ascendant. This is the kind of freedom you would embrace if you were really worried most of all about fascist and communist totalitarianism. Yeah. So I'm trying to you asked about how I see the 20th century and the arc of liberalism in the 20th century. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to recapture and reformulate some of the ambition that liberal thinkers had, I think, in the progressive era and up through the New Deal era. I mean, embodied in figures like John Dewey and John Rawls. And sort of juxtapose that to a more chastened and moderate kind of liberalism that I think isn't serving us well in this moment.
So, Alex, your first chapter is equal freedom, and it forms really a foundation for the rest of the book. And I want to talk about as we get into the book here,
Mm-hmm.
what this means, what you mean by equal freedom, how that differs from what we have. The term freedom, as I know you're well aware, has become stretched to the breaking point in recent years. I mean, we've got the most frequent use of it is in the context of like people who want to be able to say slurs without getting yelled at on the internet. I mean, the free speech brigade,
Mm-hmm.
many of whom will then turn around and say, but you shouldn't be allowed to say free Palestine on a college campus, right? So it's just become a word that I think has been emptied of meaning, really, and it's important, I think, to try and recapture that and to understand what it means, not just that we have freedom, but equal freedom. I think is an important concept here. So, can you kind of talk about where this comes from and what you're envisioning.
Yeah. So let me say, first of all, I think you're absolutely right. The term freedom is used in absolutely promiscuous ways, and it's stretched in all kinds of ways to mean anything and everything. Um, at this, and so one response to that might be, well, let's reach for some other political concept that has more definition. But unfortunately, I think we're stuck with it. I mean, so one of the things that I mean, believe deeply as a result of my own work in the history of American ideas is that by and large, people who succeed in appropriating that term and positioning themselves as its champion win most political arguments in this country. And so, it's a term that still has tremendous currency, I think, in our political culture. And so I think it's really important to compete for it, to grab hold of it, to bend the meaning and the arc of it as best we can towards more inclusive and egalitarian aims. Right? So, and that's part of what I'm trying to do in the book. And so, we talked a little bit about this negative idea of freedom, which is predominant on the right. And when you talk about, Elon Musk's invoking free speech as a way of forestalling any kind of government regulation of his social media platforms, or people invoking free expression to justify death threats to Olympians or whatever. I mean, this is right. This is the kind of keep government off my back sort of vision of freedom. And so what that's not the idea of freedom that I embrace in the book. I'm trying to defend what you might call a positive conception of freedom. Freedom, in my view, the kind that's really worth having, means the power to make choices. And that, of course, what do you need? And I argue in particular in that chapter, we're free to the extent that we have the power to choose among a broad range of secure and desirable options. Right? And I'm happy to get into those weeds if you want. But basically, that's an idea of freedom that points in a very different direction than the we're free to the extent that other people are leaving us alone view, right? Because what do you need to have to be empowered to make choices? Well, yes, you need not to be oppressed, right? But you also need to have access to resources and opportunities, right? You need economic mobility, you need education, you need access to healthcare, right? So you're not debilitated by crippling illnesses or by medical debt, for example, right? So this idea of empowering people to make choices points towards a very different vision of what society could be, and it points and it invites us to sort of think about how we create the sorts of conditions under which people can exert some meaningful control, give shape to their own lives, live according to their own ideals and aspirations, and enjoy meaningful opportunities. All right. So so to the extent that freedom should be centered in our political discourse, I think that's the idea of freedom we want to go for. And I think it needs to be very strongly wedded to an egalitarian commitment. Right. So you ask about the meaning of equal freedom. I mean, the first thing that means, and exclusions have been so commonplace in the history of American liberalism, right, that it's tempting, and many people are tempting to say that they're part of the very DNA, right? But there's always been this competing sort of radical tradition that says, no, when we talk about who's entitled to freedom, who's entitled to fundamental rights, who's entitled to the full range of opportunities and social respect that make free life possible, we're talking about everybody, right? And to the extent that there are groups and populations that that lack freedom, or that enjoy less of it, or that are suffering under structural constraints that diminish their opportunities, that treat them with disrespect or disdain, that undermine their rights, that one of the central thrusts of liberal politics has to be to pull down those structural barriers, to open up access to this power to make choices equally to everybody.
So this is very much like FDR's second Bill of Rights, right?
Yeah.
Like the idea that it's not enough to just get government off of people's backs, which is what freedom has become over the last 45, 50 years in this country. It's the sole focus is getting government out of people's lives, is this mono obsessive focus when it comes to freedom. But what you're articulating is something that would in fact require government intervention to redress these inequalities so that people do have equal access to opportunities.
Absolutely, absolutely. And also, yeah. So, um, yes, the book is very focused on a lot of this. So how do we? I mean, how do we? What sorts of interventions would be best calculated to expand people's range of options and opportunities? And some of those are involve expansions to welfare state. Some of them, but many of them involve attacking the fundamental power imbalances which lie at the root, I think, of our current situation, right? A robust antitrust agenda, going after and rethinking corporate governance, I think, absolutely prioritizing the rebuilding of organized labor. I mean, one of the things that's been fundamentally defective about, I think, Cold War and libertarian liberalism is its power analysis. It rests on a deficient power analysis. Right? There is no hope of achieving widespread, durable freedom for everybody unless we commit to rebuilding the sorts of institutions through which, frankly, working people can exercise countervailing power against business interests and the wealthy in this country. That's a major theme throughout the book. So, and that too is going to require government to refashion the rules of our market economy in fundamental ways. Right? So yeah, I mean, again, happy to get into some of these details if you want.
I would, but I think this is a useful time to talk about the alternatives you refer to and why a type of radical liberalism would be superior to a Marxist alternative or a post-structuralist alternative. It might be worth articulating what those are and why you think this approach, particularly for this podcast, like I'm a historical materialist. I think at least when in terms of analysis, Marx got a lot right, more right than he got wrong. So what are those alternatives and why is this approach, in your opinion, better?
Yeah, and I don't. I mean, I think it's really important for people on the left right now, no matter what they call themselves, no matter what labels they prefer, to find common ground and pull in the same direction. I sort of see myself as making common cause with a lot of folks, who consider themselves, who label themselves democratic socialists, working sort of within the liberal tradition to bend it towards similar policy objectives.
And then just very quickly, and
Yeah,
then the issue is in actual historical reality, what has that happened is that the liberals always dominate the left, which is, that might be more of a historical question because I agree theoretically totally. But in actual history, the liberals kicked the left out of the coalition and have always, made them a subservient position. But that is almost orthogonal. Sorry.
and you're talking about the United States.
In the United States.
Yeah,
Sorry, yes, in the
yeah.
United
No,
States.
that's right. I mean, that's absolutely right. And of course, I mean, part of that has to do with prudential judgments about what the American public will tolerate and be willing to embrace, right? And whether those prudential judgments are correct or incorrect, right? But yeah, I mean, so when I envision the relationship between socialism and liberalism, I tend to think in terms of a Venn diagram, with two big ovals and a substantial overlap in the middle. And so I would place people who lie on the sort of left flank of American liberalism, people like Dewey and Rawls, very much in that. I mean, you could describe them as making common cause. I mean, as a matter of principle, with democratic socialism for sure, right? So I don't. I mean, and right, and there's this. I don't know if you know Matt McManus. He just came out with a book
Liberal
on
socialism. Yeah,
liberal
yeah, yeah.
socialism. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of people in both the American and the European tradition, from Edward Bernstein to Carlo Rosselli to Leonard Hobhouse and others who you'd put in that the area of overlap there. And so, to me, it's less important sort of what we call ourselves as to what extent we agree on the substance, and a lot of frankly, a lot of the stuff that I'm arguing for, and I mean so there's a real materialist streak in the book. I mean, when I talked about the power analysis, the deficient power analysis, I mean, I think, yeah, that liberals should spend more time reading Marx, frankly. there's a kind of, I mean, certainly at the heyday of the sort of Washington consensus neoliberalism, there's this sort of naive elite-driven view that you can have, and this is embraced to some extent by folks on the left who grow up under the Warren Court and kind of see the Supreme Court as this kind of impartial, enlightened arbiter who can set just constitutional rules within which the rest of us can then basically go about leading our lives. But yeah, I mean, I think so. For me, any plausible discussion of how you move towards a freer society now depends on acknowledging the tremendous distorting power of concentrated wealth in our system, and depends on acknowledging the fundamental and resilient antagonism between capital and labor in capitalist societies, such that when the wealthy come to dominate the political system and when they come to accrue the tremendous economic power that they accrue, they're going to use it to stifle and exploit. I mean, one of the main chapters in the book is titled Exploitation, and it's about how pervasive I think economic exploitation has become in the American economy. So that, I mean, to that extent, right, I think that my analysis of what's gone wrong fits very comfortably with a sort of socialist analysis. Yeah, go ahead.
So then I have to ask, why not just be socialist? Like, if it is to reclaim a radical liberalism that in historical terms has just aligned with capital again and again and again. I mean, this is true. Not saying the New Deal wasn't good, but it was to save capitalism. Ultimately, I think that is correct. And obviously, the neoliberal term, which is to me a paradigmatically liberal turn, it's more of a historical question. But like the liberals have always aligned with capital, and still align with capital, whether you're looking at the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, both of which I think are species of 19th century liberalism. So, just why? Why liberalism? Why not socialism?
Yeah.
I mean, obviously terms, blah, 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 but you know what I mean. The book's about liberalism.
Right. So, I mean, there's kind of a principled and then a practical, right, answer to that. And I mean, I do think that socialism remains a tough sell for the American electorate. And I think the kind of robust anti-capitalism that's almost always been a feature of socialist rhetoric is self-marginalizing in our political community right now. So partly I'm sort of thinking about how we can, working with the sort of moral and cultural resources that we possess in our society, how we can make the best case possible for a more egalitarian and inclusive and fair and humane society. And I think that working within the idioms of liberalism, but this relates to my view that those idioms have been the dominant idioms since this country was founded. Certainly not the only ones, but the dominant ones. Is the powerful move to make right now, and this is the ground we need to contest, I think. Now, but also, look, I mean, my dad was born in Lithuania a few days after the Soviet invasion. A bunch of his a bunch of his parents, acquaintances, and friends ended up in cattle cars headed to Siberia. We're now in a moment of extraordinary assault on the sort of fundamental liberal protections, the right to protest peacefully, the right to criticize government, right? The right to enjoy a semblance of free and fair elections. All right. So, I mean, to me, the basic architecture of liberal protections, constitutions and rights and independent judiciaries and free medias and all of this occupy a really important role, have always occupied a really important role in my own political imagination, right? I think these core liberal strategies have been the only ones that have successfully tamed authoritarian power in the modern world. And so to me, I mean, so my own political identity has been shaped and to some extent tethered to my awareness of the value of those institutions. Right? So
So,
So
just a
yeah,
question about that. Do you think those are paradigmatically liberal? Because there are certainly socialist traditions. I mean, just look at the Weimar era Social Democratic Party. I mean, that is always my, because I agree 1,000%. You know, I like political liberty, and I think it's important. I like media liberty, etc. I guess I'm not sure why identify those specifically with the liberal tradition. Because I don't think they necessarily are.
yeah. I mean, fair point. I think. I mean, the way I understand this is that they were originally articulated. I mean, and now going back to, like, we're talking about the sort of long liberal tradition that goes back to people like John Locke. That they were originally developed and articulated as part of this proto-liberal and then liberal constitutional tradition, and that I mean, they're certainly not emphasized in Marx, right? And that socialists came to understand the value of and appropriate those and fold them into a kind of reformed liberal or moderate socialist or reformist socialist tradition, which I admire a lot, right? And so I mean, but I think like the relationship between republicanism and liberalism, you know, socialism and liberalism have cross-fertilized in all kinds of ways, both in the sense that, you know, socialists like the Fabians in Britain are influencing, you know, Americans in the progressive era, and vice versa. So I, you know, so I don't, yeah, I mean, I don't need to be proprietary about those things. I think as a matter of sort of genesis, they belong most centrally to the liberal tradition, but I'm happy to have that argument.
No, no, fair enough. I think that's probably true. I think it certainly was not the focus of Marx. Absolutely. Then you get into things like letters and his actual blah 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 blah, which
Sure.
we
Yeah.
don't have which we don't have time for. But no, I think you're right. I think they were absolutely first articulated by liberals or proto-liberals in the 18th century. I think there's no question about that. Let's return to the book. And I want to talk a little bit about race and ecology, because we've talked about tyranny and we've talked about labor exploitation. So let's talk. What role do you think racism and racial hierarchy has played, and what does a sort of equal freedom approach help us do with regards to that vexing issue?
Um, yeah, I mean, um, that's a big question, obviously, and a lot to say about it. You know, racial exclusion has been obviously a sort of profoundly central feature of the American political tradition, and the liberal tradition in America. You know, I certainly would, you know, some of the sort of seminal thinkers articulating liberal ideas in America are figures like John Calhoun, for God's sake, right? But
Yeah, he's the
but
libertarian hero, right?
right,
That's who
right.
they, before racism became, just totally anathema. That's who they trace themselves to.
Yeah. And at the same time, I mean, as I was saying earlier, you know, when you look at the sort of radical moves being made by immediatist abolitionists in the 1830s and 40s, they're drawing on this kind of competing radical Lockeanism, right? And articulating their drawing very heavily on the sort of language and the tropes of the Declaration of Independence and the Lockean ideas of natural rights and stuff. So from the beginning, you have this contest between exclusive and racially inclusive and exclusive versions of liberalism in this country, and of course, the racially exclusive ones were dominant for a very long time. Um, yeah, so there's one of the main chapters of the book is about racial hierarchy in America today. I think you can't be serious about equal freedom, the ambition to create a society in which people enjoy equal freedom, without confronting the enduring reality of racial hierarchy today, right? And so, you know, there's so many ways of entering into that landscape, right? The median wealth of white families is almost 10 times that of black families today, right? Talk about differential incarceration rates and differential rates of arrest and imprisonment. You can talk about the extraordinary. I mean, if you look at people born between 1985 and 2000, um, almost 2/3 of Black children in the United States grew up in high poverty neighborhoods, compared to something like 6% of white children. So just extraordinary differences in the life trajectories of African Americans in this country. You look at the quality of schooling in majority minority schools; it's atrocious compared to majority white schools on average. Right? That there are just so many different ways, and we can get into the history of housing discrimination, exclusions from the New Deal order, et cetera, which contributed powerfully to all of this. But I mean, the upshot is, yeah. Look, I mean, status hierarchies and racial hierarchies are enemies of equal freedom, and the objective now has to be to try to unwind these as best we can. We're moving obviously in the opposite direction under the Trump administration, but to the extent that there are, I mean, so I don't know how much detail you want about this. I mean, with each of these chapters, I talk about the sources of the problem as I understand them, the ways in which that those problems have been facilitated by certain aspects of liberal ideology.
Right. I think that's the way I talk about it a little. Like, how do you, because this is my question ultimately about American empire. How do you get the good parts without the bad parts? Right. Isn't that, like, people want to save babies, abroad, but then you also get Gaza. And you could say a similar thing about liberalism, right? There are certainly emancipatory elements, but in historical time, non-emancipatory things were pursued. So race, we could view it through the lens of race, but like, as a fundamental question, how do you propose doing that? Like, getting the good without the bad? Do they not go together? Would that not dialectically suggest the need to transcend liberalism into a new ideology? I'd just like to hear your thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, boy, I wish I had the answer. I mean, I will say I don't think this is a problem that uniquely confronts liberalism. If you had just substituted the term socialism for liberalism in the last few sentences, we'd be asking a very similar question, right? How do we get the emancipatory potential without a lot of what's been horrific in practice? And I don't know the answer except to try to continue fighting from within, to grab hold of, and I think we can certainly learn from some of the emancipatory movements, whether we're talking about abolitionism or civil rights, or the movement for gay marriage and LGBTQ rights, or which built significant grassroots power and laid claim ideologically to the more kind of inclusive and egalitarian versions of these core liberal principles, be they freedom, be they equal opportunity, be they equality of rights, and really kind of built political coalitions around them. So I think it's an ongoing fight to try to, and that you never, I mean, anytime any political ideas or ideologies enter the field of political power, they get distorted, misused, reappropriated for unjustifiable purposes, and it's a continual struggle to try to prevent them from being used in those ways, to call out the abuses, to try to call us back to the better and more defensible meanings of our core principles. But I mean, and that's that's what a lot of us are trying to do, I think, in this moment, whether from within the socialist or liberal or progressive or social democratic traditions.
I think let's end on the issue of the crisis of liberalism, and I have a question for you about that. And people listening to this podcast have heard this, so not to bore them, I will go through it quickly. I always say that Fukuyama was right, and what I mean is that he was right to a certain degree about capitalism, but he was wrong about liberalism. That we are all capitalists now, except North Korea. But liberalism seems to have been withering away, that you could actually just be capitalist like China or Russia, and you don't need the liberalism. And that from a historical standpoint, we might view the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries as uniquely ideological, because it does seem that liberalism has reached a crisis point. It does seem to me, at least, that it's exhausted. There's a reason that you're trying to revive it, essentially, by claiming a new type of reforming a new type of liberalism, or finding a deep substrate. Sam Moyn did that also recently in his book Liberalism Against Itself, which articulated a similar claim. So I'm curious, why do you think liberalism is in crisis. Do you think the 21st century is going to be as ideological as previous eras? Because basically, one political economic form has won. You, we as a species have decided how to organize industrial modernity and post-industrial modernity. That might lead to our downfall with the climate, TBD. But it does seem that there's like, it surprised me, at least as a historical matter, that there haven't been like a flourishing of new ideologies, whether you're thinking about people trying to explain Trump through fascism or people trying to revive liberalism. It's a turn to the past. So there was a lot there, and I'd just like to get your reaction to that as we wrap up here.
Yeah, yeah. There's a lot there, and to some extent, the answer is I don't know. But I will say, I mean, I before we pronounce liberalism exhausted and dead, I mean, I think, it's still the case that liberal assumptions run very, very deep among the American electorate. And B, I think, when uh, if you look at the mass protest movements that are developing now in response to Trump's excesses, I actually think we're seeing a kind of reinvigoration of liberal commitment in this country. I mean, one of the things that's always struck me about my students is that they've never grown up with any sense of imminent political threat. That they took the kind of constitutional architecture and democratic architecture of the country very largely for granted, and that people are not doing that right now. Right? They understand increasingly that we're facing the possibility of an illiberal and undemocratic future, right? And so whether, if you look at the signs that people are holding up at these No Kings protests, right, many of them are articulated in the terms of, the rights of due process, right, free speech rights, democratic accountability, right, the integrity of the democratic of our Constitution, right, so the imminent threat that we're facing now, I think, is and I've seen this change in the last few years in my students, is in a way, I think, refreshing people's appreciation for core liberal values, and also their interest in sort of laying hold of that tradition and seeing what they can make it do for us, beyond this kind of defensive posture. And so, and that's, again, I'm not, I'm not sitting here saying we need to entirely look to the past. I'm hoping, like you are, that we see a kind of flourishing of new and interesting ideological configurations. I mean, I think we've seen that to some extent in the Green Movement and the conversations about sustainability. But for me, right, what's really critical is that whatever ideological direction we move in, and I think we're entering a more fertile ideological space now. The neoliberal consensus is definitely fractured and gone right now, right? And as to what's going to replace it, it seems really important that we remain deeply committed to a sort of core architecture of liberal protections and institutions, whatever else we're committed to. So that's, I guess and so that's part of what I'm sort of arguing for in the book. But
It's there's a sort of a question, like, to kind of come back to Danny's point, like, why a book like this is necessary in the history of liberalism. We've seen it adjust to crises in the past. We've seen it adopt forms, change in ways that, reform in ways that adjusted to the needs of the populace. That doesn't feel like it's happening right now, which I think is what you're sensing in your students, who are frustrated with, sort of stultifying current liberalism, and the idea of modest reform in the face of huge challenges and huge crises that liberalism doesn't anymore seem to be capable of dealing with. And I guess, like, to come back to the idea that maybe Trump, maybe this is a shock to the system, and you're going to see the generation of something new and more, kind of vibrant or more active. coming out of it. It just doesn't feel like liberalism has had that juice for a long time, and I think that's maybe where some of this is coming from.
Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, I mean, liberalism has yeah. I think you're right. I mean, um, and
And Trump,
so
I would add,
I'm
like
certainly
Trump is
sympathetic.
himself a reaction to that, right? Like
Mhm,
that the support for Trump is a reaction to the fact that like things are on a status quo that just goes nowhere and helps nobody, and things sort of stay the same. But then, the alternative still, even now in the second go round with this man, the alternative is still the same stultifying, like, moderation, neoliberal. I know the consensus is breaking. I agree with that, but the leadership of the opposition party isn't on that page yet. Like
mhm,
the
yeah.
places where people can go in this system as it currently exists to find an alternative are places that we've already been and that people
Mhm, mhm.
rejected because they weren't doing enough.
No, I think you're right. Look, so when the Trump coalition is finally swept from power, right? When people, and we're getting closer to that as long as we can have free and fair elections, I think, or some semblance of them, right? We're going to have a real moment of opportunity, right? There's going to be an opportunity to set a new direction, and there's going to be, and I mean, right? You see the fight internal to the Democratic Party right now about what direction we should go in. There's going to be plenty of moderating voices looking back towards a kind of modified neoliberal consensus position, right? Hearkening for the sort of supposed normalcy of the Obama years or whatever, right? And I mean, one of the core arguments in the book is, and one of the things I'm trying to help do with this is to reject that, right? To say, no, look, that there were so many profound problems with that society already. Our economy was so far structured in a way that benefited the elites at the expense of working folks. That we shouldn't. We need to chart an ambitiously new course, right? And so I'm trying to do that from within the liberal tradition and clarify the ways in which there are all of these resources and have been for a long time that have existed on the kind of left radical side of the liberal tradition that can help us, right? Others obviously are trying to do that from within other traditions. I welcome that as well. But look, we need to, the labels aside, I think we need to be pulling in the same direction, making common cause.
I think that's a nice, hopeful way to end. Alex, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, check out his book, Freedom for All, link in the show notes, and we'd love to have you back again soon. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, guys. Appreciate it.